Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for WEC's first Reliability in the West discussion series of the year. We appreciate you joining us. Today is February 5th, 2025. Today we'll be having a discussion, continuing our discussion about large loads and taking a look at some system performance risk and a little bit of an operations view on large loads. I'm Travis English, WEC Senior Training Outreach Specialist. Appreciate you joining us. We're going to take a look at WEC's antitrust policy. All WEC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WEC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WEC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WEC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have questions, please contact our legal counsel. With that, I will turn it over to Chris Raper, our Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs here at WEC. Chris?
Yep, thanks, Travis. We have a great conversation today. We have Scott Beyer, who is the Transmission Expansion Planning Director for PacificCorp, Tricia Johnstone, Director of Operational Readiness for the CAISO, and Kyle Thomas, who is the Vice President of Engineering and Compliance Services with Elevate Energy Consulting. And we are going to talk a little bit more about large loads. So last year, at the end of 2024, in this discussion series, we did address large loads actually across a couple of our discussions. There's a lot to talk about with regard to large loads. So in October, we talked about kind of the role of government, the economics of it, the different regional perspectives. And then in November, we spoke to the impacts of the large loads and the nature of the risks, and also the comparison of electrification and large loads coming everything everywhere all at once is a phrase that we like to use. So today we are going to talk a little bit more about the operational impacts of large loads and system performance risks. So I am going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and kind of what they do for their organization, how large loads fits within the work that they do, and then we will have a discussion. So Scott, do you want to go first? We may have actually lost him just as we were doing an introduction. All right, I'm going to move to Kyle and I hope that Scott's able to get back on.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here again and talking about this topic. I enjoyed our October discussion and really look forward to continuing it today. I'm Kyle Thomas, Vice President of Engineering Compliance Services with Elevate Energy Consulting, and we are a consulting firm supporting the overall industry on kind of this everything everywhere all at once. We have a lot of topics and a lot of technical changes, fundamental changes to the system, both on the generation side, on the load side, which we're here to talk about today, and also everything in the middle with new technologies, more expansion and growth and development than we've ever seen before. So tremendous amount of opportunities, but also brings with a lot of challenges that the industry is working on tackling and that we're trying to support. So look forward to talking about it here.
Thanks, Kyle. Scott, glad that we got you back on screen. Do you want to do a quick intro of yourself and kind of your work and how large loads impacts it?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for the technical glitch, but Scott Beyer, Transmission Expansion Planning Director for PacificCorp. And I've been doing transmission planning in the industry for about 20 years now. And I would say that just really the last, well, for us, it's been about 10 years, but really the last 3-4 years, just the ramp up in large load additions, impacts in the system really have changed how we have to evaluate the system. The ways that we have to be proactive in planning the system. It's not enough to just kind of set ourselves up for, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, when you have really these kind of just shifting changes, just really change the nature of our system. So.
Great, thanks, Scott. And Tricia, and I'm going to warn anyone who's listening that in the vein of everything everywhere all at once, Tricia learned about 5 minutes before she got on this panel discussion today that they're doing testing of her security system, like fire alert system behind her. So we're going to work with that and get her on and off of mute as we can to be part of this discussion. Tricia, go ahead.
Yes, no worries. Sorry, they didn't fit it in before this call started, so I'll mute suddenly if it starts up. So I'm a Director of Operational Readiness for California ISO and RC West, and my team is involved in all the forward activities in preparing projects that are going to the control room. So software and policy change management, as well as like the new construction, new loads, new resources, everything that gets scoped in for the network modeling process for the CAISO BA for RC West area and for the Western energy market areas. And I would say that like our interest in this from my team's perspective is we actually do the full cycle from the advanced planning through to kind of the post-event analysis. And we keep the scorecard metrics and things for operations. So, you know, we're looking at, you know, how can we better prepare our operator training and tools and monitoring, forecasts, you know, all those critical inputs that you need for real-time operations, and then also have the operators prepared to react when the unplanned things occur. And then in our post processes with compliance and event analysis, capturing, you know, what do we learn and how do we kind of continue to improve data quality and that real-time monitoring and situational awareness.
Okay, thanks to each of you. And if our prep call last week was any indication of the dialogue today, then I'm excited because the prep call was terrific and the dialogue was great. And I want to remind you that we'll have our teams manage on the back end questions from the audience, so you don't have to pay extra attention to anything else. We'll capture all those and ask them as they come in, and feel free to answer each other's questions, ask each other questions. And I'm going to start with, what are, you know, each of you have spoken to how it's impacting the work that you do. So what are some of the biggest on the ground impacts that large loads can have on the system as a whole?
Maybe I could start just from the transmission planning side. When we first get the requests in, it's really a complete change to the infrastructure, generally speaking. When we're talking about, large loads that are in the hundreds of megawatts, a lot of the local system where they're siting was maybe designed for a maximum load equal to or less than the load that's being requested by that customer. So in a lot of ways, we're kind of looking at, how do we build it from the ground up, but then how do you integrate it with the bulk transmission system that's there? That can require pretty significant infrastructure upgrades upstream as well. So I would say in general, while we are looking at, in a lot of ways, like a new system in that vicinity, the interactions with the existing system are the most complex, and the part where we need to ensure that we're not negatively impacting the reliability of service to our existing customers while bringing on this large load to the system.
Definitely. And I think that that's probably been shown to be a real thing, right? I know commissioners are concerned, particularly the state commissioners are concerned about impacts to other customers as these humongous loads come on. Tricia, is there anything from like the market platform perspective and trying to manage all this that has presented itself as different and unique that you're having to address in real time?
Yes, we recognize that there are kind of pockets of large load growth throughout our balancing authority area and actually throughout our customer areas in the RC and wider market. In California in particular, the Energy Commission is actually projecting out, what they see for increases in large loads, and particularly for data centers out through 2028 and beyond, right? So I think our challenge jurisdictionally at the ISO level is a BA and a TOP that's working in coordination with the transmission operators and distribution providers in our area, is making sure that our operators are maintaining the appropriate level of jurisdiction to not become overwhelmed by a lot of additional data that is actually in the jurisdiction of the distribution provider. And so it's, kind of trying to find that balance where our teams need it for forecasting purposes, and they need to know in the real-time time frame how those loads might be shifting and impacting, what's happening in the real-time market, so that way we can try and smooth those things out. And then, of course, the operators have the tool sets to manage if the unexpected happens, then they can react. But we really want to try and, I think this year one of our big objectives around kind of planning and tool and data improvement is figuring out, what that right balance of information is. We don't want our operators to have to monitor down behind the meter. Right, we want them to stay at the grid BES level.
Right. Yeah, I find that has become more and more complicated with all the things, right? Not just large loads, but that jurisdictional definition that used to look really clear is a lot grayer. It's a lot muddier than it used to be in order to keep track of all the things that are going on, because they do in fact impact each other. So you kind of have to know, you have to have some high level knowledge of what's going on with that. Kyle, I know that you've been a part of a lot of the research into the large loads, and what we don't have is historical knowledge, right? And so what are some of the things that you have found high level that we should all be aware of as we kind of go down this path without historical knowledge, but knowing that this is going to be big?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think if we look at a little bit of historical large loads, these are not necessarily new things that we've interconnected the system. We've done very large industrial facilities over the years, things like arc furnaces and smelters, and very, very large industrial facilities, over our life of building this amazing grid that we have. We learned a lot on how those interconnected. We learned how they operate. Sometimes it was learning while we were operating them. We learned how they impacted the grid. Customers, power quality impacts, ride-through performance. We learned all that, and then we worked to develop industry standards and mitigations on those facilities. We maybe had a little bit of quiet time, and now all of a sudden we have that kind of growth coming again, albeit now it is certainly new types of large loads, data centers, cryptocurrency mining, AI, training facilities, and that type of thing. And we're kind of going back through this learning curve where we're, as an industry, on both sides, on the electric grid and on the large load industry, we're learning how to interoperate together, and how these large load facilities might manifest themselves in real-time operations. And that's a one thing that I think fundamentally, both in operations but also in planning, that we fundamentally always try to do is make sure we understand how these things that are connecting to our system, whether it's a load, whether it's a generator, or anything else in between, how is it operating, so that we can know that in advance and mitigate things in the both planning world and also the operational planning perspective, making sure that we have eyesight into 6 months out, 1 month out, 2 weeks out, and even tomorrow. Being able to predict these things as much as possible is how we can make sure that these risks are mitigated. And I think that's what we're in the loop of right now. We're very much, as an industry, learning how these new loads do operate, how we should model them, how we should study them. And we're doing that a little bit in real time. And we got to get ahead of that fundamentally, working very closely with these large load developers and the owners and operators, and diving deep into the technical research and the technical work of how these facilities are built, in order to really get some mitigations in place. And so thankfully, I think that's starting to really happen across the board. But we need a lot more of it, a lot quicker, to really solve some of these technical challenges and problems that I think we're starting to see some leading indicators around the system of some of these potential problems.
Yeah. And Kyle, to your point about getting the large load customers involved in the conversation, right? I know that we think from an industry level, to us, I think is often the utility level, right? And the engineers and people in operations. And what have you all found? I'm curious, because I think it's developed over time a little bit. I hope it continues to develop, but it's almost like the electrification of transportation. It occurred, and the industry, the car industry, the transportation industry was like full steam ahead. And then we kind of got them to a point where we were like, okay, like we need to have some conversations about what can actually be done here. Do you feel like the large load community is more willing at this point to begin to have and be a part of the conversations as we move forward? Because we don't know what we don't know, right? We only know half the story. So has it been y'all's personal experience that they seem to be more willing to be a part of the conversation in order to make sure that the utilities can do for them what they want and need them to do? Tricia's shaking her head, so let's start with her.
Yeah, I think that engagement is happening, and probably at a couple levels. I think one is they're engaging with the utilities, right, to make sure that the infrastructure is in place to support what they need. But I think we're also seeing the engagement with like the Energy Commission and organizations like that, because that's really what we count on, is that the Energy Commission is accounting for these things as part of the energy demand forecasting, right? So we can make sure that we're building the resources and that the construction timelines are working to have the bulk electric system infrastructure in place, certainly to support, and then kind of in coordination with the utilities, they're having to make sure that their local infrastructure is prepared. So I do think we're seeing that, because especially probably for the more sophisticated types of large load customers, I think they understand that early engagement will actually save having issues later on, right? It'll smooth out the process and have more predictable timelines.
Scott, I mean, PacificCorp operates across 6 states. Are they seeing that there is movement in a particular direction on some of these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Tricia said about, the sophistication level and really the wanting to understand the overall system. I mean, it's not as much, maybe historically with, like, say, a manufacturing facility or something where it was sited in a location and, just kind of in a way kind of plugged in to the system. And we're seeing with the customers really wanting to understand the regulatory processes within the state, the community that they're in. When they site facilities, they tend to site in clusters that have, other infrastructure, telecommunications, water, that those kind of really locational needs where they want to be able to continue to develop that area, to its fullest extent. So they need to understand, from the electric system, fully upstream, the generation supply, the transmission to get it there to the load, but also kind of the regulatory process for. They engage to understand, where are the touch points where this is going to become a challenge moving forward, understanding kind of community fatigue and customer fatigue, and really trying to ensure that, they are getting in front of that. And that's helpful for us as a utility because, that's the same world that we live in. We want to make sure that we are doing right by our customers at all times, and we need to engage with our customers' needs and ensure that we're aligned with them. And so having a large load customer who is approaching it from that same perspective, I think is really helpful.
Yeah. So Kyle, with you, I'm going to modify the question a bit because your role is different in this part of the industry. But to me, there's a mindset question here, right? With WEC and our internal teams, we talk a lot about mindsets. And I know the utilities are in a position where historical mindsets in some ways are just no longer helpful for trying to figure out the future, right? And so is this a mindset change on all levels? Like, do we need to sort of hit everything everywhere all at once? I mean, because commissioners need to understand why utilities need more generation and transmission in order to be able to serve these types of customers, because utilities need a guaranteed recovery of costs for those things, and the large load customers. It feels like it's everything needs to move in tandem on this in order for us to be able to keep a reliable grid, because those facilities, I mean, the anecdotal info I have is that a data center can be built in as little as like 18 months. And we all know that generation doesn't get built in that amount of time. And so how do we address that? How do we hit the mindset question in order, because the industry has been run a particular way for so long. Yeah. How do we most successfully address that?
Yeah, great question there. And just to talk to your mindset standpoint and kind of our historical mindsets and approaches, I think that's one of the fundamental things that we all have in common. All players right now in the electric grid, generators, loads, and the utilities, we all have the same goals, right? We are really after grid reliability. These large load customers, they're really pursuing, perfect power, right? They are operating a critical societal service that we all use. I mean, we're using it right now on WebEx. And so it runs our everyday life. And so that pursuit of that perfect power is what they're after. That pushes us on the utility side to really strive for that. But that's something that we've always had in our, core mission to serve of reliable, resilient power, affordable, cost effective. And, maybe the newest one, to your point, is speed, right? They are on an exponential growth that's probably unlike anything we've ever faced in the grid standpoint. We've built our grid up over the past 120 so years. And it's not getting easier to build infrastructure necessarily. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. And now we're faced with this amazing opportunity that is rapid growth to meet societal demand. We're all moving in that trajectory. So it does challenge some of our regulatory policies, our typical approaches. But if you think about how those were formed, it was all formed to ensure reliability and resiliency of the system. So you're facing kind of these two conflicting, maybe appearing conflicting, but we have to move together to reach those same goals. No large load developer, I'm sure, doesn't want to impact any existing customers and cause any negative reliability. That jeopardizes their own operations and also then jeopardizes the bulk power system in some ways. So because we're aligned on those activities, I think we can resolve that. I think we're all after the same thing, but that exponential growth, we're just, historically, us as humans in society, we're not really good with exponential growth at times. And so that does challenge things. But I think what we're seeing, maybe it took a little bit of a ramp up, and now we see this activity and this discussion happening everywhere right now. And those large load developers are involved, and they're pushing and they're funding these studies and these technical working groups and task forces kind of everywhere in combination with the utilities. And that's a good sign that we're all at the table together. And we're learning together and growing quickly, but we do have that gap you said of they can build far faster than say we can build on the grid side. So that is going to require their help at the table, and they're looking at a lot of new creative solutions and opportunities there, and I think we can all learn from that, and I think we'll get there in addressing it, but it's going to take kind of a whole industry looking at those historical mindsets and maybe those historical policies, and how can we maintain that affordability, reliability, resiliency while meeting this kind of new growth that is one of the biggest opportunities we've ever seen.
Yeah, I love the use of opportunity as opposed to challenge, right? You used opportunity several times in there. It is an opportunity and it's a challenge, but if we see it as an opportunity, then I think that's the positive side of it. To your point too about everybody working together, Brianna Cohor, who is kind of a standard in our industry these days, she's with Google, right? So it's one of those data center large load customers. And she posed a question at a panel recently that I loved, because from where she sits, right, she's looking at a utility saying, you must serve and I need this power. But the question that she posed, and I have it on a sticky note on my computer, because I think it's really important to remember to get outside your own head for the way things have typically been done. And her question that she posed to the audience of people there was, who should bear the risk of demand forecast uncertainty for these large load customers, to Tricia's point about the forecasting and the ability to do that. And so I feel like that's totally outside the box, right? It's actually not putting it immediately on a utility. It's saying maybe these large load customers that are coming in that haven't been part of an IRP process, so because they couldn't be anticipated, maybe they bear some of the demand forecast uncertainty. So I love that in her part of the industry, that she's one of the people that is the forward thinkers on who might do this and how might this be done in a team, right? How can we do this with a partnership? So I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm curious, large loads may not be fully covered under mandatory standards. So how does this affect the way that they coordinate during system events like widespread heat waves, cold or winter storms? Is there anything that requires them to coordinate?
I could jump in initially. I think transmission interconnections, we have open access transmission tariffs. We have rules for anyone that's working interconnect. So those certainly come into play here. But when you get into some of the technical requirements, technical information there, I think the large part of that happens at that kind of utility direct connection with the large load customer, where that type of information exchange has to happen. And right now, pending any regulatory policies that might require certain information to be exchanged or certain design considerations, it's been on that very close relationship between the utilities and the large load developers. I mean, I'm really curious, Scott and Tricia, if that tracks with what you all see. And I think that's where, some policies and support can help to make sure, one thing that we've learned from the integration of inverter-based resources in our generation fleet, which also is undergoing the exponential growth. You're everything everywhere all at once, Chris. We learned that, if you get consistent policies across the board, which is where regulation comes in and standards and that type of thing, it can work to speed up the processes and make consistent approaches so that everything is fairly standardized as much as possible. Of course, there's going to be differences between sites. So that I think is an approach that we've learned and we can apply here as well. And that could be voluntary, right? Every entity could work to define those requirements, define the types of information exchange that has to happen. Your forecast example with Google is a great one. Part of that is, what is that realistic forecast that's coming from these developers? And the utilities have to have that information. We can't just predict it with our traditional forecasting algorithms and aspects. We've got to see what they are projecting on their side. And you can take that information exchange happening at the models, the studies, the technical developments and characteristics that they have. It's all about that information sharing at the planning stage, and then also throughout the interconnection process stage. And of course, even in operations, if a 500 megawatt large load developer had an outage of some sort for half of that load was gone, well, an operations staff and generation dispatching needs to know that. If that's going to be out for 2 weeks, that's a big amount of load that can impact our generation dispatch. So that type of information sharing happens today organically through, interconnection processes, PPAs, and other types of interconnection agreements. I think the rules right now are loose on what needs to go in there. So I think we have opportunity to improve that, like we did with the generation fleet and our inverter-based resources. So we can learn from that. And I think that's where policies and regulatory aspects can really help us here to get consistency across our whole grids here. Just my take on it. Love to hear, Scott and Tricia, if that's a similar experience on your side. And
yeah, I'll just say I think you're hitting it right on the head with there, which is we've got the opportunity right now to really look at it from a national level, from a regional level, and get the right standards in place and the ability to evaluate more more discreetly, more to the technology that's there. I think we've had kind of more of a binary way of evaluating large loads. It's on or it's off. You have planned outages and coordination that happens at the customer level, which is with these large load customers has tended to be really good interaction because they're sophisticated. They understand what's going on in the system. They'll see disturbances on the system remote with their devices and reach out and go, hey, I saw this, can you explain what happened there? Because they're wanting to know really how the system will interact with them. And they do have on-site backup, but there comes restrictions with that in terms of air quality permits and things like that. But I think that the one thing that really is I think something that we didn't necessarily see with other large load additions that have happened historically is this is happening across the country. There's not really just one ideal location that data centers in particular are hitting. We're able to have this conversation across all the utility sector because all of us are affected at once. And I think, with inverter-based resources and really what we've been doing over the last decade to make sure that we can properly model those and evaluate those, I mean, that sets us up for this, newer technologies, servers, and other devices that, may have, certain interactions with the system that we aren't even aware of yet. And how do we get aware of those before they happen so that we can be proactive and not reactive?
To frame it kind of in context for like the operational tools and kind of the planning, like if you're talking about kind of normal times, no extreme weather conditions and things like that, our operations planning analysis processes are really trying to look at things hour by hour, right, and understand, how things are changing, and potentially, that we're peaking potentially at times that are different than where we've peaked in the past, and things like that. So we are watching that really closely, and then of course seasonality applies because that will also shift. We definitely see that there's influence with the retail programs that the utilities have with the large load customers, and we'll see impacts to if there's like a kind of time of use charging type schedule, the operators are going to see a spike or a drop depending on if there's an incentive to charge or discharge, particular times, right? And so we've had to figure out how to accommodate that into our forecasting and try and smooth it out so that way we don't have those showing up as abnormalities like on a daily basis. But then when you talk about planning for extreme weather conditions like winter or summer or just kind of other types of events going on, we have an emergency playbook we've been using for a few years that actually holds pretty well. It's just the variables that you're dealing with are different. And I think from a load perspective, where we're hoping we'll see some of this go in the future is a lot of the retail programs around demand response and emergency demand response, and like in California we've got Flex Alert, things like that, have really been focused around summer programs. And so, from an operator perspective, you just need to know what you have in your toolbox, right? So we've got demand response programs, which are just kind of normally participating all the time and dispatch based on economics. And then we've got other ones which are waiting for some kind of trigger, either a utility trigger based on temperature or some other kind of conservative operations, or an emergency declaration by us or an EE8 watch by us. We tend to have more of those emergency programs available to us in the summertime, like, May through, I think like October 1, than we do at other times of the year. So those programs don't go away in the winter, but the numbers available to the operators to call upon are much, much smaller. We also, even in the summertime context, depending on which load customers are enrolled in those programs, you can see differences in how much is available on a weekday versus a weekend versus a holiday. So, it was mentioned like manufacturing customers and things like that. Well, if they aren't 24/7 operations and they're not normally on over the weekends, we're not going to get any megawatt relief from those emergency demand response programs over a weekend or on a holiday. So we are, as we learn things, it goes into the playbook and it goes into the considerations. And so we know our operators will be a little bit more conservative on how much they can actually count on from those programs, like on weekends and holidays.
So I love that point, Tricia, because that's really important, right? That how is this affecting all the other things? Because we have time of use rates. We have a whole system that's been created on the presumption that we've got these special kinds of loads. Special contract customers sometimes get a particular kind of rate because they're using an off-peak time frame in order to run the majority of their operations, and they did that so that they could get a special rate, and so how has the large load customer impacted those traditional, again, back to mindsets, right? Those traditional ways that a utility dispatches its fleet and plans for its generation? Like, is it going to cause an overhaul in the system? I mean, Rocky Mountain Power, right? Part of PacificCorp has time of use rates in different parts of its territory. that was because you're trying to offset the use patterns and sort of level that out a little bit, right? But with these large load customers, is there a presumption that they just elevate the use all the time? So those things hold true, like you were talking about, Tricia, or is it something different than that that's going to require people to really the utilities to plan differently?
Yeah, no, I think that there's kind of like the normal operations part of it, right? And we definitely need to improve how we're planning for, you know, what's happening in those programs. And we don't, you know, own the programs. We're not a party to those agreements or anything else. And each of our utilities might have some slight variations on what they're each doing, right? So that's the challenge for our forecasters, you know, on that part of it. But then when you do get into these stressed operational condition days, what might be normally scheduled for those programs, you need to make sure that the programs have the triggers in place where we may say, hey, if we declare a certain condition, we actually are going to need you to shift your usage that day. Like, we may tell you, no, don't charge until after this emergency condition's cleared, or something like that. And so I think that's really where we're trying to kind of closely coordinate, is make sure that the signals that the utilities may send out to those customers, or that we send out to the utilities, that those are coordinated, understood, so that way our forecasters and our operators can better predict how much relief might be available to us. And that has been helpful each year. I would say you know, the information gets better and better.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're learning.
Just to jump in on that one, I love that discussion there, partly because you're in a way, we're starting to talk about like less firm transmission service and moving to more flexible transmission service, or even distribution service, right? Electric service in general. And that is an opportunity in a way to speed up interconnections, right? If you don't need that firm, like to meet the peak day, and you could say, hey, under that peak conditions, whether it's peak winter, peak summer, what have you, new maybe emergency conditions, Tricia, like you're saying, if they have an opportunity, and these are very, you know, sophisticated technology advanced resources with, you know, very robust backup generation often, can that be utilized to give that flexible service and help support under the peak conditions? And then maybe we don't have to. The only counterpoint to that is the both planning and operational considerations to know those peak conditions and emergency conditions, and what can they do, what capabilities, what's in the contract, all those types of things has to get distributed from not just the interconnection process, but it's got to go to operations, it's got to go to planning, so that they can be correctly analyzed, and put it into the models, put it in the studies, so that those new, you know, assumptions and scenarios can be looked at. So fantastic, like type of new evolving structures that are happening, but you know, how does all that information get shared between all the teams that need to know that these are the new types of scenarios that can occur? And I think that's one of the challenges we're seeing, is making sure that, you know, back to information sharing among all the right departments within a utility and grid operators and such is key to making sure we're all aware of how do these things operate under a variety of situations.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see in the future too, if large load customers start to get paired with generation, you know, from the beginning, or with storage from the beginning, where they've got the ability to like flex their load. I think, you know, a few years ago, when we really got into, you know, what are all the tools in our toolbox for the emergency playbook, the backup generation for a lot of the data centers might be running on diesel or something, so they might have limitations on when they can run, and they aren't necessarily manned by a 24/7 operations center. You know, they might have to call out, you know, their campus ops to be prepared to turn on the backup generation at, you know, 6 o'clock on a Friday, you know, which that might not be normal for them. And so that's one of the things we consider as part of our playbook, is if there is going to need to be some kind of, you know, declaration from the state or, you know, others that to say, hey, we're going to relieve you of your permit obligations kind of during this period of time in order to help take some load off the system and support this emergency, that has to be done in advance. You can't do that at 5 o'clock on a Friday and say, oh, we need the relief right now, you know, hey, head maintenance guy, can you get out and turn on the backup generator? Like there's a lot of coordination that leads up to that.
Yeah. Scott, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd only probably add two little small things, which is that, you know, in large part, the reason why we're talking now is because of the availability of data and the uses for analyzing data and making the best use of data. And I think there's a big opportunity for us there is that we now have more system knowledge and knowledge about the customer load profiles, both with the new large loads and our existing customers and you know, distributed customers around the system. And how do we best make use of that to you know, to find those optimal times of operation, those points where we're going to need to really, you know, bring on additional generation resources or, you know, change our maintenance plans. So, you know, I think historically we've been able to, I think Tricia brought it up, you know, kind of plan for maintenance on the weekends or holidays or during shoulder seasons, you know, both with generation and transmission. And as you know, we bring up that baseline where these are kind of additive, moving up the total load profile and moving up that base. You know, those seasonal shoulders become more stressed, the weekends become more stressed. We don't really have those time opportunities necessarily as evident to us. But I think, you know, there are, I think, ways that we can start to work through and find, okay, well, what can we do where we're not just reacting to the load profile, but maybe making use of the load flexibility to still be able to, you know, effectively maintain and operate our integrated systems.
Right, that makes sense. So we're getting a bunch of questions from people who are listening. I'm going to read them. I read them verbatim more or less. So sometimes they make sense to me, sometimes they don't, but they'll maybe make sense to you. We did have a question. NERC recently published a lessons learned on the abnormal behavior of large loads during normally cleared grid faults. And the question is WEX seeing any of these issues? I'm going to modify that to say, is the Western interconnection seeing any of these issues, the abnormal behavior, and or have any of you seen the document out of NERC on the lessons learned that has added to your playbook?
Scott, I'll jump in first and feel free. Yeah, no, I think that was a great first type of report from NERC on a large event that occurred last summer where there was a normal. A fault is never normal, but as we know, operating the grid, they always happen. The scale of our system is so enormous that, you know, in search of perfect power, we're not there because faults just, they do happen. As much as we try to mitigate them and reduce them, faults do. But if detailing that report, right, it was a normal clearing fault and it went through a normal reclose cycle. You know, that reclosing after a fault is a very normal practice that we have. Well, on the East, it's very normal. I think in the West, with various things, you all do reclosing, though it's probably different than the East, just due to different system conditions. But we've always done reclosing because a vast majority of faults are temporary. They're not permanent faults. So reclosing is a fantastic way to get customers back online automatically and quickly and improving our overall reliability of the system. Now, what we saw in that event is a normal fault and reclose sequence that the utility has had for decades, introduced undervoltage ride-through situations on the data center side. And so this starts to raise that question. Well, we didn't know both sides of the coin there, didn't know those reclosing conditions and how might they impact the protection and control systems of the data center side. And that's an example. We've got to have that fairly deep technical discussions between, say, the protection and control engineers at the data center doing that design work and the grid protection and control engineers, right? And that type of very close coordination discussions have to happen. One of the big challenges is that confidential, very competitive information on the large load side. It's very hard to get that information on the grid side. So we got to figure out how to resolve that so that we can share that information and make sure this type of thing doesn't happen. And so then it gets to one other point here is the question of, well, does the data center need to update their controls to meet these grid normal functions, fault clearing and reclose cycles? Does the grid need to change? If there are limitations on the large load sides, maybe we can't do that reclosing conditions like we always have. And I think realistically, it's probably going to be a settlement or a technical resolution that will have changes on both sides. But then we get into the best of both worlds, and we know how these things will operate under the different and make changes on both sides where needed. And that's fine. But right now, it's just kind of we're normal on this side, maybe normal on this side, and we've got to have those really technical, decision and discussions so that we don't find that out when a fault happens. We found it out in the interconnection process when we're doing models and studies and what if scenarios, and we find it there and fix it before it goes in service. And so I think that's a great event. Not a great event. It's a bad event, but it's an event that didn't result, I think, in too many widespread outages of any sort. But gives us a leading indicator of this is the type of event that we might start seeing more, and we've got to get ahead of that before we do have a much, much bigger event that starts to cause bulk power system reliability problems.
Yeah, for sure. Anything to add, Tricia or Scott, to a lessons learned kind of document, right? We don't know what we don't know until.
Yeah, I just think it's great that we're elevating this up right away. I mean, I think that, we are kind of keyed for it as an industry because of the inverter-based resources and some events that we've had. And really those interactions between, just kind of typical utility settings and settings options that are available on inverters or other, kind of technology sources at the end use or the generation supply. And how do we make sure that we are, we're not setting ourselves up with gaps that like information gaps where we don't know what's set on either side of the system, and really just kind of bringing that up to the highest level where nationally we can have that conversation, we can dig into it, and we can, we don't replicate an event that was just local geographic in an area when really all of us might be subject to the same concerns and we just aren't aware of it yet.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I would throw in, and hopefully people don't throw rocks at me, is from a registration perspective. Like this is a case where it seems like the onus is on the utility, right, for the coordination, and then they're working, with an entity that may not necessarily be aware of those interactions and that potential risk, right? So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how this develops out, because we don't have an LSE registration. So it's like it's probably somewhere in the space between resource planners and distribution providers or something. But yeah, I think, then I guess it'll end up coming down to kind of interconnection agreements and utility processes, really, in order to make sure that correct coordination is occurring.
Okay. And Travis and the team are behind the scenes are going to put the link to the NERC. It's called, the title was NERC Incident Review and Guidance on Voltage Sensitive Large Load Integration. So they'll put that in the chat for everybody who's listening and anyone who wants to take a better look at that. So we have another question that asks about RAS schemes. So RAS are fairly unique to the West and potentially an issue. And the question is, can you speak about application of remedial action schemes for interconnection of new large loads, both as a cost-effective long-term solution for low probability conditions and also as a near-term solution to meet customers' interconnection schedules?
I can speak a little bit, keeping it general, but I think that we have used remedial action schemes as a short-term approach for bringing large load customers on because they are, it may be instigated by very rare grid events. I would say in the conversations I've had with large load customers, their view has been, that should be temporary, and that the reliability and redundancy of the system is really important. That the uptime for their facility is really key. And so, I think that it's been a bridge toward having the infrastructure there 24/7. But I think that one potential limitation of remedial action schemes as well is as we start to get larger and larger loads, then the amount of load that might be subject to be tripped from a remedial action scheme, or conversely, the amount of generation that might be tripped or something like that, can have very significant system impacts. And so I would say, it's a great tool, but it needs to be used, very thoughtfully and cautiously.
Yeah. Tricia looks like she's just going to agree with that one wholesale. And
I agree.
yeah.
And the only thing I'll add in there is if you think about that NERC report we just talked about, and that was no RAS scheme, that was just a fault with trip and reclose conditions, kind of your bread and butter protection. RAS schemes are a step up of complexity, testing, involvement, NERC standard applicability for them. And so they're a great tool, but the complexity of that and coordination, it's taken that event and even multiplying in there. But there are positives to maybe they can have a great opportunity to connect things quickly. But is it I think in the East often it's like a shorter term solution, kind of like you said there, Scott, on deploy it to get things connected, but then get the longer term transmission upgrades or distribution upgrades that are needed. And then that can be retired. And so now you're getting back to a normal protection and control complexity.
So the next question from the listeners is probably more for Kyle, but I'm happy to have anyone weigh in. And they said large load teams are going on at ESIG and NERC. WEC is looking into large loads also. Is there anything national or regional teams, any other national or regional teams that you're aware of that people could plug into?
I think you highlighted the NERC Large Load Task Force, the ESIG Large Load Task Force. We had last year the WEC. You all did the Large Load Risk Assessment and Industry Advisory Group there. So that covers the main ones. I know that IEEE has this on their radar. They've got a standard that was actually driven by a very early event, I think in 2019. I think it was in the East Coast Data Center Alley area. UPS of a data center trip event. So IEEE has a standard development. The number escapes me, so we could find that and send that afterwards. And I think there is an IEEE effort that's also building on a large load and grid interconnection project that might take form of maybe a guideline or even another industry standard on this. And then the last one that does come to mind is CGRE as well. Kind of the international counterpart to IEEE, but has a huge U.S. national committee presence and many utility involvements. I think they've got large load interconnections on their radar as well. But I don't think the IEEE and CGRE are as formed and set up as the NERC and ESIG ones and the WEC ones are. But those are two, I think, that to be on the lookout for in the coming months, I think, of what may develop there.
Okay. Tricia, Scott, aware of anything additional? Okay. So there's another question from people who are listening, which you may or may not want to answer, which is totally fine. I'm okay with you saying pass because I'm not looking to try and paint any of you into a corner. But the question is, what strategies can be employed to align data center growth with clean energy goals and ensure that their power demands don't conflict with the decarbonization efforts? And I know that those things are state by state. We all do. And again, anyone who would like to address that.
Well, maybe I'll just say, I think that both from a state goals perspective and a customer preference perspective, the use of renewable resources that may not be fully dispatchable 24/7, has come up in a lot of the conversations. And it's really, how do we size that appropriately so that we have that 24/7 power availability? Is that, through use of storage, but with the transmission system and the interconnection availability, if you have a non-dispatchable resource, you might end up with, maybe a multiple of nameplate capacity that needs to be added to the system. And how do you integrate that fully? So I would say that, it is at this point, I would say the conversation is with large load customers, how do we get that generation availability to serve that load? And I would say in large part, those are clean energy resources that are being pursued either by the utility or by the customer. And I do think that is, one of the, I think maybe challenges is if you can't site that locally, how do you connect enough of it and transport it reliably to the location where it needs to be used?
Only thing I'll add in there is I think that the large load growth and the renewable growth and the generation growth that we're seeing, they're both exponential happening at the same time. So that's a fantastic match. And I think many of these very large data center owner operators and developers are some of the biggest clean energy procurement providers or developers themselves. So there is a natural one-to-one connection there that's already been established and pushing the industry. It already has, and it's going to continue to. They have these 24/7, 365, always running these data centers on clean energy. To get there, that's going to require more and more decarbonization, or I should say renewables, connecting the system. And that's kind of driving both happening at the same time. And we're also seeing that the development of renewables and batteries may be some of the fastest resources we can get connected. So at this time, that may be a nice solution to what we have overall.
So Kyle, I agree that many of these large loads are also looking for that renewable, clean, green energy for their power. And I also learned recently that not all of them are. And I find that to be interesting, right? Because generally the industry that is the data center industry is kind of the same element that is advocating for clean and green. And we had a conversation, I believe it was with a Virginia commissioner, who they're okay with whatever it is that the utility can get online that can power their data center and get it up and moving. And so I thought, I had presumed that it was they were all looking for the clean green energy component. And in fact, they are not. But yes, I would agree with you that generally speaking, that is the case. And it was a Maryland commissioner, which one of my staff just corrected me on, which I'm glad for, because I don't want to misstate those facts from prior discussions we've had. So we are almost down. We're down to the last couple of minutes. I knew it would be a quick hour with you all. I'm curious, last question, like lightning round. What is the one thing, if you can pick one element of this large load conversation that you can ask an industry stakeholder to be most aware of going forward so that we get where we need to be with regard to large loads and being able to provide that power reliably to them? What is the one component of all of this that you would ask them to pay closest attention to? And we'll go Scott first.
It's hard to pick one. I guess, I would say that just trying to avoid sticking with what we know already in the norm and the way that we've historically done it. Just being flexible toward knowing that the load profiles are different, the load components are different than what we've done before. The grid itself that we, have been fortunate to be operating because of, like I think Kyle brought up earlier, arc furnaces in the Pacific Northwest where I am, aluminum smelters. That the system was designed around those, and we've been able to operate towards that. Don't necessarily anticipate that the system that we have today is going to just be, built up in the right way. That we may have to make some changes in how we operate the system, from the day to day, hour to hour, sub hour to sub hour, to accommodate that. So I don't know that that was a great answer because it's more than one thing. There's probably like 10, but
it goes to mindsets though, right, Scott? Yeah. So we're going to go with mindsets on you.
All right. I like it.
Tricia.
Probably just to add on to that, it's that we are in this kind of continuous learning mindset, right? And so not only like the large customers, but we've been actually also encouraging like the large generation customers, like engage early and often. And then from our side, we and the utilities just continue that outreach and that conversation and that education, because the technology just continues to evolve, and we need to anticipate and stay ahead of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Tricia and Kyle.
I'd say overall, operating the system in an unknown condition, unknown operating states. And that's, I say operating there, that's both the planning piece and the operations and everything in between. Every individual kind of person involved in that process, whether you're on the utility side, generation side, and the load side, has a place to help give information, and that requires sharing a lot of probably technical details, but we have got to do that at scale so that we're just not flying blind in any of these situations, so that we all know what to expect on both sides, and can then ensure that we have, reliable power and trying to pursue that perfect power goal. I think everyone has that capability to do it today. And if we get to that state of regulations and policies that help that, fantastic. But in the meantime, we can do things about that right now.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank each of you. I really appreciate the conversation today. Large loads is going to continue to be an opportunity and concern for those of us looking at and paying closest attention to reliability of, for WEC's perspective, the bulk power system. And I'm glad to know that y'all are part of the conversation more broadly, with industry and all of the stakeholders that are involved. Really thank you for your time on this conversation. And I'm going to pass it back to Travis to close us out.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. To Tricia, Kyle, and Scott, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining the conversation. We knew it was going to be a good conversation. There was a lot there. To our audience members, I'd like to thank you for joining. As Chris mentioned at the top of the hour, you can view our previous Reliability in the West series. We talked about large load. I'll share a link to that in the chat, as well as I invite you to take a survey. As we continue to develop the discussion series, we'd like to have your feedback. So I'll provide those in the chat for you. And then mark your calendars, because March 5th, at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, we will be continuing our discussion. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and just hope you have a great day.
Thank y'all for the opportunity.
Thanks again.
Take care, guys.
Have a great day.